Let us begin with what war actually is. Not the war of paintings and monuments. Not the war of trumpets and parades. The war that gets hammered into bronze and placed in public squares so that future generations can walk past it without feeling anything. That war, the cleaned-up war, the war with its causes simplified and its costs hidden and its heroes frozen in postures of nobility. That war has almost nothing to do with what happened in the mountains of Jamaica for a decade, from roughly 1728 to 1739. Between the Maroon communities of the Blue Mountains and the John Crow Mountains, and the colonial government of a British plantation island that could not afford, politically or economically or psychologically, to let them exist. The real war, the one I want you to hold in your mind for the next hour, is something else entirely. The real war is a woman checking the position of the lookouts before the sun comes up, because the lookouts have to be in place before first light, and if they are not, people die. The real war is a child who has learned, before she has learned to read, before she has learned to count past 20, that when she hears a particular sequence of notes blown through a cow horn in the middle distance, she is to stop what she is doing, make no sound, and move into the forest by the path she has memorized, and wait there until an adult comes for her. The real war is a man who spent the morning planting yams and the afternoon hiding a body and the evening trying to remember what his mother's face looked like before all of this. The real war is not a separate event that pauses normal life. It is woven into the fabric of everything, into the farming, into the child rearing, into the grieving, into the praying, into every single moment of every single day for 10 years. And it costs something that no monument will ever adequately record. This is what I need you to understand before we go any further. The Maroon community in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica in the 1720s and 1730s was not an army. It was a society, a fully functioning, extraordinarily complex human society, built by people who had survived the unsurvivable and then had the audacity, the sheer defiant audacity, to build something out of what remained. They had farms. They had governance structures. They had spiritual life. Rich, intricate, demanding spiritual life rooted in the West African traditions that the slave ships had not managed to destroy. They had healers and leaders and arguments and love and children born into freedom in a place where freedom was technically illegal. They had everything that makes a community rather than a collection of individuals surviving in proximity. And they were trying to defend all of it, simultaneously, without pause, for 10 years, against the most powerful colonial empire on earth. That is the context. Hold it. Do not let it go. Now, why was the British colonial government in Jamaica in a state of what can only be described as sustained, escalating panic throughout the 1720s and 1730s? Let me be precise about this, because the reason matters, and it is not simply that the Maroons were raiding plantations, though they were. It is not simply that British soldiers were dying in the mountains, though they were. The real reason, the reason that kept the governors of Spanish Town awake at night and filled their dispatches to London with increasingly urgent language, was what the Maroons represented. What they proved, every single day, simply by existing. The plantation economy of colonial Jamaica rested on a foundation that was not physical, but psychological. The physical foundation was enslaved labor, the bodies of African people and their descendants forced under threat of extreme violence to produce sugar and coffee and cotton that made British merchants extraordinarily wealthy. But under that physical foundation was something more fundamental still. The belief, required to be universal, required to be unbreakable, that there was no alternative, that the condition of enslavement was permanent, that escape was not possible, or if it was possible, it was not sustainable, and the attempt would cost you everything, and you would end up recaptured and publicly punished in ways designed to make everyone watching understand that the attempt was not worth making. And then there were the Maroons. Every enslaved person on every plantation in Jamaica knew that Nanny Town existed. Not as a rumor, not as a legend, but as a fact, a place, a real place, in the real mountains that you could see from the lowlands on a clear day, where people who had been where you were had gone and were living free. That knowledge was aflame. The British colonial government understood, with the clarity that comes from genuine fear, that you cannot maintain a system of total psychological control when there is a visible, functioning counterexample sitting in the mountains above the people you are trying to control. Nanny Town was not just a military problem. It was an epistemological problem. It was proof that the foundational lie of the plantation system, that there was no alternative, that this was simply the way things were and would always be, was a lie. And proof of that kind, once it exists, cannot be reasoned away or legislated away. It can only be physically destroyed. So the British tried to physically destroy it. They sent expedition after expedition into the mountains. Professional soldiers, not just colonial militia, trained men brought from England and elsewhere, men who had fought in European wars and knew how to conduct a military campaign. They offered rewards. They brought in trackers. They sought alliances with groups who might be willing to help them navigate terrain they fundamentally did not understand. They escalated, year by year, as each failed campaign cost more money and more men and produced less result, and the Maroons remained, and Nanny Town remained, and the knowledge that freedom was possible continued to exist in the minds of every enslaved person in Jamaica. What the British never fully understood, what they could not understand, because understanding it would have required them to abandon assumptions about the people they were fighting that they were constitutionally unwilling to abandon, was that they were not fighting a rebellion. They were fighting a nation. And this nation had been preparing to fight them, specifically, in this terrain, using these methods, for years before the first British soldier set foot on the first mountain trail. Let me tell you about how the Windward Maroons fought. Let me be specific, because the specificity is where the genius lives. The abeng. Begin there. The abeng is a cow horn instrument, a hollowed section of horn that, in the right hands, can produce a range of tones and rhythms that carry across mountain terrain with astonishing clarity. The Maroons had developed, over years, a communication system using the abeng that functioned across the entire territory they occupied, a system so sophisticated that British forces moving through the forest could not take a step without the Maroons knowing about it. Scouts posted across the ridges and peaks would relay information about troop movements through abeng signals that the British could hear but could not interpret, in the same way that you might hear someone speaking a language you don't know and understand that communication is occurring without being able to understand a single word of it. The result was that the Maroons always knew where British forces were, and British forces almost never knew where the Maroons were. In asymmetric warfare, information advantage of that kind is not a minor factor. It is the whole game. Then there was the forest itself, or rather, what the Maroons made of the forest. British soldiers moving through the dense undergrowth of the Blue Mountains were moving through terrain that was, for them, hostile, disorienting, and essentially featureless. Every ridge looked like every other ridge. Every trail looked like every other trail, except that half of them weren't trails at all, but false paths designed to lead pursuers into positions from which extraction was difficult or impossible. The Maroons had spent years studying this terrain with the attention of people whose lives depended on knowing it exactly. Every ravine, every ridge, every hollow, every natural ambush position, every site where a small force could hold off a larger one indefinitely simply by virtue of geography. They knew it the way you know your own home in the dark, without hesitation, without error, entirely by instinct. And then there was the camouflage. This is the part that the British soldiers, in their dispatches, kept returning to with something that reads, even across the centuries, as genuine bewilderment. Maroon fighters would cover themselves, their bodies, their faces, their hair, with leaves and bark and soil, becoming, functionally, indistinguishable from the forest floor or the undergrowth around them. A British patrol could walk within feet of a Maroon fighting position and see nothing, hear nothing, and then find themselves under attack from what seemed like every direction simultaneously before they had any clear picture of where the fire was coming from. The ambush was not just a tactic, it was the totality of the military doctrine. Never fight in the open if you can fight from concealment. Never engage on ground of your enemies, choosing if you can choose the ground yourself. And since you know this terrain and your enemy does not, you will always be choosing the ground. These were not improvised tactics born of desperation. They were the expression of a military tradition, specifically the Akan military tradition of the Gold Coast of West Africa, which had produced some of the most sophisticated armies on the continent, and which the enslaved people who built the Maroon communities had carried in their bodies and memories across the Middle Passage. The Akan understood asymmetric warfare, understood that a smaller force fighting on its own terrain with superior intelligence and superior knowledge of the ground could defeat a numerically and materially superior enemy, not as a desperate last resort, but as a developed doctrine, refined over generations. When Nanny and the Windward Maroons adapted these principles to the Jamaican mountains, they were not improvising. They were applying inherited expertise to new terrain. And it worked with a consistency that the British colonial government found, to put it plainly, humiliating. And then there is Nanny herself. Nanny in the military dimension, which is inseparable from the spiritual dimension, and I will come to that, but let me hold the military for one more moment. What Nanny understood, in a way that military theorists in European academies would not codify for another 2 centuries, was the fundamental principle of asymmetric conflict, that a smaller force fighting a larger one cannot win by meeting the larger force on its own terms. You cannot beat a superior conventional military force conventionally. What you can do is change the terms of the conflict so completely that your enemy's conventional superiority becomes irrelevant or becomes a disadvantage. You can make the cost of prosecuting the war, in money, in men, in time, in political capital, so high that continuing becomes more expensive than concluding. You can turn the terrain itself into a weapon. You can make your enemy afraid, not of you specifically, but of everything. Because when you cannot see the enemy and the enemy can see you, fear becomes pervasive, and pervasive fear degrades military effectiveness at every level. Nanny understood all of this, not as theory. She would not have used any of those words, but as the lived, practiced, refined knowledge of a woman who had been fighting for her people's survival and fighting effectively for years. She was a military strategist of the highest order. The British came to understand this not from any document or testimony, but from the simple, repeated, expensive fact of encountering her strategy and failing against it, year after year, expedition after expedition, governor after governor. Now, the spiritual dimension. And I say now not because the spiritual is secondary. It is not secondary. It is not separable. It is the same thing seen from a different angle. But because the listener needs to understand the military concretely before they can understand what the spiritual adds to it. Obia, the word itself, the practice itself, carried such power in colonial Jamaica that the British eventually passed specific legislation to criminalize it. The Obia Act. Think about what it means when a colonial government passes a law specifically targeting a spiritual practice. It means they are afraid of it. Not dismissively afraid. Not the condescending fear of the rational man confronting what he considers superstition. Genuinely, operationally afraid. In the way that you are afraid of things that you have seen have concrete effects on concrete situations. The British were afraid of Obia because they had seen, repeatedly, what it did to the people who practiced it and the people who believed in it, which was to make them, functionally, harder to defeat. Before battle, the Maroon fighters participated in ceremonies that connected them to their ancestors, to the dead who had fought, and the dead who had been taken, and the dead who had never had the chance to fight, but who were present nonetheless, in the spiritual understanding that the Maroons carried from West Africa, in which the ancestors are not gone but transformed, not absent, but present in a different mode, still capable of acting in the world, still capable of protecting and guiding the living. These ceremonies were not psychological comfort, though they were also psychological comfort. They were understood by everyone who participated in them, with complete seriousness, as literal military preparation. You went into battle accompanied. You went into battle as part of something larger than your individual body and your individual courage. And that understanding changed things. It changed the mathematics of what a person was willing to do and what a person was capable of sustaining. And then there is the legend of Nanny's ability to catch bullets. I want to be careful here because this legend deserves careful treatment and not the kind of dismissive rationalism that collapses everything it cannot measure into the category of superstition, and not the kind of uncritical literalism that refuses to think about what it actually means. So let me think about it with you. The story, and it appears in multiple accounts, in different forms, across different sources, is that Nanny could catch the bullets fired at her by British soldiers. Catch them. In her hands, in her body, somehow, in ways that the accounts vary on but agree about in their basic claim, that British bullets could not kill her, that she was, in the most direct possible sense, impervious to the weapons of the enemy. What does that mean? Here is one way to think about it. A leader who is believed, genuinely, wholeheartedly believed, by her own people to be impervious to the enemy's weapons is, functionally, impervious to the enemy's weapons. Not because the bullets change their physical properties in her presence, but because the belief of the people around her changes their behavior in ways that have concrete military consequences. Her fighters fight differently when they believe their leader cannot be killed. They fight with a kind of absolute commitment, a willingness to hold positions, to push forward, to refuse retreat, that they might not sustain if they believe their leader was as vulnerable as they were. And their enemies fight differently too, when the story of her invulnerability precedes her, when the soldiers coming up the mountain have been told, by other soldiers who have come up this mountain before them, and come back down, without the result they were sent to get, that there is a woman up there who catches bullets. Fear is a military force. Belief is a military force. Nanny understood this with a precision that her enemies never matched. The spiritual and the strategic were not separate domains in her understanding. They were one thing. The woman who led the ceremonies before battle and the woman who positioned the ambushes after them were the same woman, and neither role was more important than the other, because neither worked without the other. I want to say something else about this. The British response to Maroons' spiritual practice, the criminalization of obeah, the contempt they expressed for it in their official documents, the way they wrote about it as primitive superstition that enlightened people needed to suppress, was itself an acknowledgement of its power. You do not pass laws against things that don't affect anything. You do not use legal and institutional force to suppress a practice unless you have evidence that the practice has effects that concern you. The Obeah Act was, in its own way, a testimony to the effectiveness of what it was trying to destroy. The British were afraid, and they were right to be afraid. Now I have to tell you what the war cost. And this is the part that I have been moving toward, and the part that the histories tend to shortchange because cost is harder to narrate than triumph and harder to display than heroism, but it is the center of the story. The absolute center. You cannot understand what happened in 1739 without understanding what the decade before it cost. People died. Of course they died. This is war, and war kills people, and saying so feels almost too obvious to say. But I want to be specific about what death means inside a community of this size, in this situation, with these stakes. The Windward Maroon community was not large. They were a few hundred people in the mountains, perhaps more at certain points, perhaps fewer at others. As people arrived from the plantations below, and as people were lost to British raids and to disease, and to the ordinary but relentless attrition of a decade of conflict. Every person who died was known to everyone. Every death was not a statistic but a name and a face and a story and a set of relationships that were now permanently broken. Think about what it means to grieve inside a war. To mourn someone who has died in a raid or a skirmish or a British assault, and then to have to be ready for the next raid or skirmish or assault before the grief has had time to do what grief needs to do. To conduct burial ceremonies in stolen hours, with lookouts posted, because even the act of mourning your dead had to be conducted with military awareness. To raise children in a community where the shadow of loss was constant, where the readiness for loss was a survival skill taught as early as the readiness to run into the forest at the sound of an abeng horn. In 1734, and this is the moment I want you to hold, because it is the hardest moment of the war, British forces, using portable artillery that they had carried through terrain that the Maroons believed could not be navigated with heavy equipment, reached Nanny town and destroyed it. This was not a skirmish. This was the heart of the community, the place where the free life had been built, the place that enslaved people on the plantations below had looked at and called hope, the place that Nanny had made. It was not simply a military installation. It was the physical embodiment of everything the war was being fought to protect. And it was gone. Nanny and the windward Maroons withdrew into the John Crow Mountains, and they rebuilt. I want you to hear that sentence again. They withdrew, and they rebuilt. Not with the resources and the infrastructure they had had before, but with what remained, in terrain that was even more remote, even more difficult, even more demanding. And they kept fighting, and they kept building, and they did not stop. But the loss of Nanny Town was a wound that did not close quickly, and the people who died in and around its fall were people the community carried forever afterward, and the rebuilding. The sheer physical and psychological work of rebuilding a society from ashes, while simultaneously conducting an active military resistance, is one of the most extraordinary things I have ever had to try to describe in words, because I am not sure words are adequate to it. There were women who lost children, men who lost wives. There were fighters who came back from engagements carrying wounds that never properly healed because there was no adequate medical care available in a mountain community under siege. There were people who developed, over a decade of this, a kind of permanent watchfulness, an inability to fully rest, to be fully present in any moment that was not attended by the background awareness that the moment might end violently and without warning, that we would now recognize as the legacy of sustained trauma, and that they had no language for except as the cost of surviving. And they paid it. They paid it, and they kept going. Because the alternative was not peace. The alternative was return to the condition they had escaped, or death, and they had already decided, collectively and individually, at a level below conscious decision-making, that they would not accept either of those alternatives. The war cost what it cost, and they paid it because they had made a prior commitment to freedom, to each other, to the principle that they had the right to exist as free people on this earth, that the cost of the war could not revoke. I say all of this so that when I tell you about what happened in 1739, you understand the weight of what the people sitting down at that negotiating table were carrying. They were not fresh. They were not ideologically comfortable. They were a community that had been fighting and bleeding and rebuilding and mourning for a decade. And the question that had arrived before them was not an abstract political question, but an existential one. What do we do now? What does survival require of us? And can we live with what survival requires? The peace negotiations came about because both sides, for different reasons, had arrived at a place where continuing was more expensive than concluding. For the British, the calculation was financial and political. The campaigns against the Maroons had cost the colonial government enormous amounts of money, money that the plantation economy could not indefinitely sustain losing. The governors of Jamaica had gone through multiple cycles of escalation and failure, each cycle more expensive than the last, and no more successful. By the late 1730s, the British had begun bringing in Mosquito Indian mercenaries from Central America, fighters who were more adapted to the terrain and the climate than European soldiers, and who could track the Maroon communities through forests that had defeated every previous attempt at pursuit. They had brought in Spanish chasseurs. They had tried everything they could think of. And Nanny Town was destroyed, yes, but Nanny was not destroyed, and the community was not destroyed, and the resistance continued from new ground, in new formations, with undiminished determination. The British were winning individual engagements and losing the war. For the Maroons, the calculation was different, and I want to be honest about this. The destruction of Nanny Town had been a catastrophic blow. The decade of attrition had cost the community people it could not replace. The arrival of the mosquito trackers had changed the military equation in ways that the Maroons' traditional advantages in terrain knowledge could not fully compensate for. The community that sat down at the negotiating table in 1739 was a community of extraordinary courage and demonstrated resilience. But it was also a community that had been fighting without pause for 10 years, and that understood, with the clear eyes that come from long experience of exactly what things cost, that the war could continue, but that continuing, it would continue to cost, and that at some point the cost would exceed what could be sustained. The crucial thing to understand about the 1739 treaty, the thing that must not be lost in any telling of this story, is that the Maroons who signed it had not been defeated. This was not the peace of a conquered people. It was the peace of a people who had demonstrated, repeatedly, across a decade of conflict, that they could not be conquered by the methods available to the British colonial government, and who were negotiating from that demonstrated position of military effectiveness. The British knew they were not winning. The Maroons knew the British knew. The negotiations took place in an atmosphere shaped by that mutual knowledge, and the terms of the treaty reflected it. What the Maroons received was, for 1739, extraordinary. Formal recognition of their freedom, not as a concession or a gift, but as a right, written into a treaty document, signed by representatives of the British colonial government. The right to govern their own territory. Land grants, specific, delineated territory that was legally theirs. The right to hunt across the island. A degree of legal autonomy within their communities that gave them the power to govern internal disputes without reference to British colonial law. These were concessions that the British colonial government did not make to anyone they considered subordinate, and the fact that they made them to the Maroons tells you everything about how seriously they had been forced, by a decade of failed military campaigns, to take the people they were negotiating with. And then, the clause. I need to say this slowly, because the weight of it deserves to be felt fully rather than processed quickly. In exchange for their freedom, their land, their autonomy, and the formal recognition of their right to exist as a free people, the Maroons agreed to assist the British colonial government in capturing and returning escaped enslaved people who sought refuge with them. They agreed to help suppress future slave rebellions. The people who had themselves escaped slavery, who had built their freedom through a decade of military resistance, who had been, every day, simply by existing, the living proof that slavery could be escaped and freedom could be sustained. Those people agreed, in writing, to help return other people to slavery and to help prevent others from doing what they themselves had done. Sit with that. I am not going to move past it quickly. I am going to stay here for a moment, because the magnitude of it demands that. There are two things I want to say about this clause, and they are both true simultaneously, and they do not resolve each other. The first thing is that the clause is what it is. It is a clause in which free people agreed to help keep other people enslaved. It harmed real people, the people who were caught and returned, the people whose rebellions were suppressed, the people who might have run to the Maroons and found refuge, and did not run because they knew the Maroons were now on the other side of that equation. These were not abstract people. They were people with names and children and the same desire for freedom that the Maroons themselves had bled for. The clause cost them something real, and that cost is not minimized or excused by any argument about necessity or survival. It happened. It caused harm. The history of it carries that harm. The second thing is that the Maroons who signed this treaty, whatever their names, whoever put their hands to that document, were not making a choice between freedom and compromise. They were making a choice between the survival of their community and the survival of their principles, and they were making that choice with full knowledge of what they were giving up after a decade of demonstrating exactly how much their principles meant to them by paying for those principles in blood. This was not the choice of people who had not thought carefully about freedom. This was the choice of people who had thought about nothing else for 10 years. And they made a choice that kept their people alive. And they made it knowing that the people who would judge them for it would have the luxury of judging from a place of safety that the treaty itself had created. History, as I said, has judged the Maroons harshly for this clause. And I understand that judgment. And I also want to say, clearly, that history in this case has had the luxury of rendering judgment from a considerable distance, in comfortable chairs, without being responsible for any actual living people whose survival depends on the decision being made correctly. There is a difference, an enormous, qualitative difference, between the compromise of the comfortable and the compromise of the cornered. The comfortable compromise, the politician who triangulates on an issue of no personal consequence, the executive who splits the difference between two positions neither of which threatens their fundamental safety, is a different category of act from the compromise made by someone who is choosing, under conditions of genuine extremity, between two things that cannot both be saved and must choose one. Condemning the second kind of compromise from the position of the first kind of safety is not moral clarity. It is moral comfort masquerading as moral clarity. And it is a masquerade I refuse to perform. What I will say is this: the design of that situation, the situation in which the Maroons found themselves, forced to choose between their own survival and the freedom of other black people, was not an accident. The British colonial government understood exactly what it was asking for in that clause, and it asked for it with full awareness of what it would cost the Maroons, and what it would cost other enslaved people, and what it would do to the relationship between the Maroon community and the wider black population of Jamaica for generations to come. The British were not simply buying a cessation of Maroon hostilities. They were purchasing, with land grants and legal recognition, the conversion of the Maroons from a symbol of universal black freedom into a specific community whose freedom was purchased and therefore bounded. Bounded by obligation, bounded by complicity, bounded by the clause. The genius of the colonial system, and I use the word genius with full and bitter awareness of what I am saying, was precisely this: the ability to design situations in which the only available choices were choices between things the oppressed could not afford to lose, and then to condemn them regardless of which choice they made. Now, Nanny. And here the historical record becomes genuinely contested, which is itself important and must be said honestly. The 1739 treaty that became associated most directly with Nanny's territory was not exactly the same document as the Leeward Treaty signed by Cudjoe in March of that year. The Windward Maroons, under Quayo, signed a separate treaty. What Nanny's specific role was in the negotiations, what she signed or refused to sign, where she stood on the terms. These are questions to which the historical record gives incomplete and sometimes contradictory answers. Some accounts suggest that Nanny was opposed to the treaty or to specific elements of it. Some accounts associate her with the negotiation of different or additional terms. There is a tradition, in some tellings of her story, that she refused to put her name to a document that included the clause about returning escaped enslaved people. There is a land grant record from 1740 that mentions Nanny by name, suggesting that whatever happened in the negotiations, she was recognized as a leader in the aftermath. But the precise details, what she said, what she signed, what she refused, what she thought, are not recoverable from the historical record with the certainty that the story deserves. I am not going to fill that gap with confident invention. I am going to sit in it with you, because sitting in it is more honest, and because the question itself, even without a definitive answer, tells you something essential about the woman. What would it have meant for Nanny to sign a document containing that clause? What would it have meant for her to refuse? She was not simply a military leader or a spiritual leader. She was a woman who had built, in a mountain in Jamaica, something that should not have been able to exist, a free community, a functional society, a living refutation of the foundational claim of the slavery system. That was her life's work, not the fighting. The fighting was in service of something larger than itself, and the something larger was this: the proof that free black life was possible, sustainable, defensible. The proof that freedom was not an abstract aspiration but a concrete, livable reality that could be built and maintained by people who had been told they were not capable of building or maintaining anything. To sign a document that required her people to help return other people to the condition she had spent her entire adult life resisting. What does that do to the foundational principle of everything she had built? Does it corrupt it? Does it compromise it into something unrecognizable? Or does it represent the terrible, pragmatic decision of a leader who understood that the survival of the community she had built, the children, the farmers, the healers, the people who had bled for this, required a compromise that no individual principle could justify, but that collective responsibility made necessary? I don't know what she decided. Nobody does, with certainty. What I know is that the question she faced is one of the hardest questions a leader can face. Not hard because the principles are unclear, but hard because the principles are completely clear and the circumstances make acting on them impossible without destroying what the principles were meant to protect. There is a broader pattern here that I want to name, because the Maroon situation in 1739 did not emerge from nowhere and did not end in 1739, and its echoes are not confined to Jamaica or to the 18th century. This is what the powerful do to the people they are trying to control. They design systems in which the only available choices are bad choices, and then they watch, and they wait, and whatever choice is made, they use it. If you resist, you are a threat to be destroyed. If you compromise, you are a collaborator to be condemned. If you survive, your survival can be pointed to as evidence that your situation was never as bad as you claimed. If you do not survive, your destruction can be attributed to your own inadequacy. The system wins in every direction. It is designed to win in every direction. And the people who have to navigate it, the leaders, the communities, the individuals making impossible choices under conditions of genuine duress, are then judged by people who have never been inside the system, who have never been responsible for real people in real danger, who have never had to decide between two things they cannot afford to lose. I think about Haiti. 1791, 52 years after the 1739 treaty in Jamaica. The same island chain, different island. And this time, this extraordinary, world-altering time, the enslaved people rose and fought and won. Without a treaty that compromised their principles, without a clause that bound them to the system they were destroying. They won completely, and they built the first Black Republic in the Western Hemisphere, and they paid for it in ways that have continued for 200 years, in the indemnity forced on them by France, in the economic isolation imposed by terrified colonial powers who understood exactly what Haiti meant, in the poverty engineered by a world that could not tolerate the existence of the proof that Black people could govern themselves. What does Haiti illuminate about 1739, and what does it obscure? It illuminates the possibility. It confirms that the Maroon Compromise was not inevitable, that there was another path, even if it was a path of almost incomprehensible cost. It shows what it looks like when a people refuses the impossible choice and forces a third option into existence through the sheer force of organized revolutionary will. But it obscures something too. The Haitian Revolution happened in a specific historical moment, a moment of global political upheaval, of the French Revolution's destabilizing effects on colonial governance, of Napoleon's overextension in multiple theaters of war simultaneously, that created conditions for success that did not exist in Jamaica in 1739. Haiti also paid. My God, Haiti paid. The payments are still being made. And the Maroons in 1739 did not have the option of waiting for a more favorable historical moment. They had the moment they had, and the people they had, and the decade of attrition they had lived through, and a colonial government that was willing, at that specific time, to offer specific terms. You cannot make the choices of one historical moment with the information available only in another. You can only ever make the choices of the moment you are in, with what you know and what you have. This is what I want to say to you about legacy. The relationship between the Maroon communities and the wider Jamaican population has been shaped, for 300 years, by what happened in 1739. The pride is real, pride in Maroon resistance, in military genius, in the extraordinary achievement of building freedom in a mountain and defending it against the British Empire for a decade. That pride belongs to all of Jamaica, even to people who are not Maroon, because the Maroon resistance is part of the inheritance of everyone who has ever refused to accept that their condition was permanent and their freedom was impossible. And the pain is real too. The pain of the claws. The stories of people caught and returned. The communities that developed, over time, a complex and sometimes resentful relationship with the Maroon towns, a relationship in which Maroon autonomy and Maroon distinctiveness could feel, from the outside, less like freedom won and more like a bargain made at someone else's expense. Both things are true. They have been true simultaneously for 300 years. The treaty did not resolve the contradiction. It created the contradiction, and the contradiction has been lived with and argued about and mourned over and never fully reconciled ever since. What I want you to understand, what I think is the most important thing I can tell you about all of this, is that the inability to reconcile it is not a failure of understanding. It is the appropriate response. The contradiction is real. The freedom was real. The cost of the freedom was real. The harm done by the clause was real. All of it is real simultaneously, and anyone who tells you it can be neatly resolved into a simple judgment, either a wholesale condemnation of the treaty or a wholesale justification of it, is telling you something that is easier than the truth. History has a tendency to want clean verdicts, to want the hero and the villain placed in their proper positions and the meaning of the story extracted and stated simply, so that we can take it away and carry it without difficulty. The story of Nanny of the Maroons and the 1739 treaty resists this with every fiber of its historical reality. It is a story about people in an impossible situation making choices under conditions of genuine extremity, choices whose consequences rippled outward for centuries and are still rippling now. And the only honest response to it is to hold all of it, the pride and the pain and the complexity and the contradiction, without collapsing it into something more comfortable than it actually is. There is a kind of moral courage that consists not in taking a stand, but in refusing to take a simple one. In saying, this is hard. This is genuinely, irreducibly, uncomfortably hard, and I am going to stay in the difficulty of it rather than escape into a position that feels clean but isn't true. That is what I am asking of you, as a listener, not to condemn, not to excuse, not to resolve, to hold, to feel the full weight of what 300 years of history has deposited in this single story, and to carry it forward with the seriousness it deserves. Let me close with her. Nanny, the woman herself. As much as the woman herself is accessible through the centuries of legend and erasure and reinterpretation and appropriation and reclamation that have accumulated around her name like sediment around a rock in a fast-moving river. She fought for a decade. She built a free nation in a mountain. She managed to hold together, simultaneously, the military and the spiritual under sustained assault, and she held them together well enough that they survived. She forced the most powerful colonial empire of her era to the negotiating table, not by being conquered and submitting to terms, by being undefeatable enough, for long enough, at enough cost to the empire, that the empire decided that negotiating with her was preferable to continuing to try to destroy her. That is an achievement of a kind that very few people in all of human history have managed, and she managed it without an army in the conventional sense, without the resources of a state, without the institutional support structures that military leaders in the European tradition could rely on, operating in conditions that would have broken most people long before the decade was out. And then she had to decide what freedom was worth. Whatever she decided, whatever she signed or refused to sign, whatever position she took in those negotiations, whatever she said or did not say when the terms were laid out before her, she made her decision as a person who understood, more concretely and more expensively than almost any other person alive in 1739, exactly what freedom costs. She had paid for it. Her people had paid for it. The dead had paid for it. And the question of what you do with freedom once you have paid that price for it, whether you protect it at the cost of others' freedom, or whether you sacrifice it to the principle that freedom must be universal or it is not truly freedom, is a question that does not have a clean answer in any era, in any place, for any people who have ever found themselves standing in that particular moral terrain. She is still standing in the mountain. That is what I want you to leave with. 300 years have passed. The British Empire that sent soldiers up that mountain has substantially dissolved. The plantation system that made her community's existence a military and political emergency for the colonial government of Jamaica has been formally abolished, though its structures persist in other forms. Jamaica is an independent nation, and Nanny of the Maroons is a national hero, the only woman among Jamaica's 7 designated national heroes, with her face on the $500 bill, her name attached to parks and schools and public buildings. And in Moortown, the town that was rebuilt after the destruction of Nanny Town, the place where the Windward Maroon community continued, and continues still, the abeng horn is still sounded on Maroon Day, every year, in the same mountains where it was sounded by lookouts before dawn in the 1730s to warn of approaching British forces. The same mountains, the same horn, the descendants of the people who survived that decade of war and made that compromised, painful, extraordinary peace are still there, still maroon, still carrying the history that the treaty both created and complicated. The mist is still in the trees. The ridges are still steep. The forest is still the forest, still holding, in its deep particular silence, the memory of what happened there, what was fought for there, what was lost, and what was saved, and what was given away, and what was kept. And the question Nanny faced, the question of what freedom is worth, and what survival requires, and whether the compromise of the cornered is a betrayal or an act of love for the people whose lives depend on you, is still being asked. It is being asked right now, in this century, in every corner of the world where people are fighting for the right to simply exist. In every negotiating room where leaders of oppressed communities have to decide how much of themselves to give away in order to keep what they cannot afford to lose. In every situation where the powerful design the choices and the less powerful have to make them, knowing that every available option carries a cost that will be counted against them. Nanny did not resolve that question. No one has resolved that question. The question does not get resolved. It gets inherited generation by generation, and each generation has to face it fresh, with whatever tools and whatever resources and whatever understanding they carry, and make of it what they can. What Nanny left us is not a resolution. It is something better and something harder. She left us the proof that the question can be faced by real people, with real names and real children and real grief and real exhaustion, with dignity and with courage and without simple answers. She left us the image of a woman who fought without flinching and built without stopping and negotiated without being conquered and stood in the most impossible moral terrain her era could produce and did not look away from what it required of her. That is the inheritance. That is what is sounded every year on that horn in Moortown. Not a triumph, not exactly. Not a simple story of heroic resistance with a clean ending. Something more honest than that, and more enduring. The acknowledgement that the fight is real, that the cost is real, that the people who pay it are real, and that they deserve to be remembered not as symbols, but as human beings. Complicated, fallible, extraordinary human beings, who stood in a mountain and refused, in every way they could manage, to disappear. We will continue this story in episode 3.